Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and we're joined here tonight in the studio by Dr. Cherif Amir, the Professor of Geopolitical Affairs at the University of Paris. Dr. Amir, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Dr. Amir, before we start talking about or having a review of the Egyptian Foreign Affairs file, let's check out what happened really today, the trilateral summit, the Baghdad conference taking place mainly between Egypt, Iraq and Jordan. Also, many leaders of many different countries from around the Middle East region. Also, the French President Emmanuel Macron was there. Now, it seems that the first topic on the agenda is the Middle East and North Africa region, security and stability issue. Also, everyone's been talking about the reconstruction of Iraq. Now, how would you really assess this summit? How important and significant is it now, holding it right now in all the global developments?
Well, this summit is very special because it's held in Jordan, and what is weird is there's some uprisings in the cities of Jordan because of the economic situation. So it's a volatile country now, and the fact that all the leaders go there is first of all a support to King Abdullah to show that we are standing with the government there, with the king. Even when the French president himself goes there, and President Sisi, of course, among all these security, it means that there is an understanding of the economic situation, the dire economic situation in the whole region, and that despite all that, there is also coordination. The fact that King Abdullah insisted that the summit takes place in his country, that means that he is willing to show the world also that we have to work together, we cannot give up. We have difficulties, we are heading toward difficult times, and we need to be together. If not, things will be disastrous for everyone. Why I started about this topic, about the situation in Jordan especially? Because this is an indicator of what is going on in the whole region. Maybe it's because of the repercussions of the COVID-19, mainly also by the Ukrainian-Russian war. But let's say that if we would not stand together, it will be like the Arab Spring. Everyone left Tunisia at that time, and we have seen what took place. If we will abandon Jordan and everyone will say no for security reasons, we should cancel it, or let's make it a replacement in other country. That means that there is a retreat in front of external threats. So the important thing is to show that not only we will work to rebuild Iraq, we will also help the countries who are in need of security and economic cooperation. And also we have to implicate the EU in the presence of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, to tell the EU, we held summit with the Russians, we held summit with the Chinese, and lately the US-African summit in Washington. And what about the EU and all that? They have disappeared from the scene. So it's time to invite them and ask their opinion about what's going on. They have a say about it. And I think that it was very wise to accept this trilateral summit at that timing. Why? Because at the beginning, we all knew that the EU had a stance towards Washington and America, and they didn't want to listen to anyone else. I think now with the sanctions against Russia, which didn't work, and it backfired towards Europe, I think that now the Europeans want to collaborate with the Middle East, with the Gulf states, with Egypt, with Iraq and Jordan, and find a broader connection outside of the North Atlantic Treaty.
Yes. Well, you've mentioned the economic situation and problem that's taking place in Jordan and within the Middle East and North Africa region, but everybody can argue that all the countries around the world, even in Europe, even in the US, all countries are complaining about the inflation, the economic recession, so they have an excuse saying, well, that how can we help you? We have the same problem internally in our countries. So how would they be able to coordinate efforts to safeguard the security and stability for Jordan, making sure no uprisings take place, making sure the reconstruction work in Iraq takes place, making sure that everyone more or less is sufficiently full of energy and crops. I mean, looking at the EU now, Germany probably have secured their gas reserves for the winter, and we're already in the middle of December, so we're halfway there. And things seem to be going on, not smoothly, but they are continuing and going on for the foreseeable future at least, and nobody really knows exactly when the Russia-Ukraine war could end. So what is their excuse then? How would they be able to help and coordinate efforts to safeguard the security of stability, not just Jordan, but the Middle East region and North Africa?
They have to do it. It's their backyard, if we can call it like that. As you said, the problems of recession and the problems of inflation and the gas problems and all that, it's happening everywhere, especially in the Western bloc of Europe. But they can still, as you said, also sustain and live with it. And yes, they have some demonstrations and they could cope with it. But there is countries like Jordan, like Tunisia. These countries are in Lebanon also. If they will fall and they cannot resist, they don't have monetary reserve to help the people, not like the West. They cannot spend wages as they're doing. They don't have Christmas primes as they do for the salaries in the West. So it's totally different. If these countries would fall, it will be a disaster for everyone. We have seen what took place in the Arab Spring, and then in Syria, and then Tunisia, Libya, and everyone said, well, these are dictatorships. We don't have to don't have to care about them. Then they had all the refugees, then the illegal immigration, then the Islamic State, Daesh, and then we lived all this tragedy.
Yes.
So I think that it's the same generation of leaders in Europe. They don't want to see this again. It's in their interest to think outside of Europe. If we will neglect the situation in Jordan, we will pay a heavy price. There is a huge Palestinian population there, and there is a right-wing government in Israel now, led by Benjamin Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, who are saying clearly the only solution for the Palestinian problem is the creation of a Palestinian state in confederation inside the territories of Jordan. So someone has to save the scene. If not, we will have all the uprising of the Palestinians inside Jordan and inside the West Bank, and a new conflict inside in the Middle East. No one would be able to pay the price now.
Well, you've raised two big topics. Now, I'll start off with the Palestinian issue because the Arab League Secretary General Ahmed Abul Ghait mentioned it in his speech for the conference, and he said that all countries, the international community, should bear the responsibility for the deteriorating situation in Palestine. Now, the Israeli offer that you just mentioned, who has the power to change it or stop it or put another solution forward, which is the two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine? Now, who actually has the power to do that? Because the usual players are the US and maybe Europe, but it's mainly the US. Do you feel that the US now can be firm about this situation, about this Israeli concept?
No. Maybe the Trump administration had a stance. They chose the Israeli side at that time. But now the Biden administration, they're struggling to regain the position of the United States again. Look, the day Biden left Saudi Arabia after the summit, the next day Jinping, the president of China, was there. It was a huge humiliation for the US diplomacy that in the same place he was replaced by the Chinese, which is a very harsh adversary for the United States, and the same people who sat with Joe Biden, sat with the Chinese leadership to talk about business, armament, oil, many things, and maybe substituting the dollar with the yuan. So that means that things are changing in the Middle East. To answer your question, who could change it? Well, surprise, it could be the Emirates, Egypt, the Gulf states, who still has a say on the Arab countries. Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't want to lose the Gulf states. He signed the peace treaties with them, Bahrain and all these countries. He doesn't want to lose it. He has a very tense relations with Jordan from the time of the late King Hussein, and now because he has the only solution, the confederation state of the Palestinian state in Jordan. So it's very tense. So his only overture outside of Israel is the Gulf states, Egypt. He doesn't trust the Biden administration. He doesn't want to lose the Russians. Yair Lapid, who was the former prime minister who will be replaced, made a huge mistake by supporting openly Ukraine. Now, listen to the Israeli ambassador in Ukraine. He said, we will not jeopardize our relations with Russia by supporting a falling country like Ukraine. We're not that crazy. So I think that who could change the scene? Maybe the Russians, maybe the Gulf states, and well, the EU made a huge mistake. The Western Bloc is that they mixed between NATO and Brussels, the decisions of the EU itself. They mixed between both of them, and then all the papers were mixed with Turkey, who is a member of NATO, and in the same time wants to be member of the EU and exercising blackmail. Europe is lost in its decisions. They cannot take it.
Yes. Well, let's talk a bit about Europe, since one of the main events that took place this year was the advance of the Russian forces onto Ukrainian territory. And it just turned things upside down globally. A domino effect of different food and energy crises, inflation, prices are skyrocketing all over the world. I want to focus on Egypt's position within all of this turmoil. Egypt has been very clear about its policy, foreign policy, for many years, talking about diplomacy, peaceful solutions, keeping a safe and friendly distance from all countries, not interfering into any country's security and stability and sovereignty and internal affairs, of course. Now, you've mentioned that the European Union in general has been a bit quiet or maybe a bit passive in taking bigger leaps or bigger steps towards solving issues over the past year because they're busy solving their own internal issues. How would you say, because all the other countries were looking at Egypt saying, what are they going to do? How are they going to tackle the situation with Russia? Because Egypt is known for its good relations with the Russian nation. How do you feel they've tackled it so far? Everybody's looking, will Egypt send gas to Europe? Will they upset the Russians? Are they going to find a way to normalize, back them or oppose them? How would you assess the Egyptian very critical and sensitive handling of this affair?
Well, the answer came by a single visit which was made to Cairo at the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine. It was from the Polish president. Poland is very aggressive towards Russia and wanted to do anything to dissuade all the region that has energy, Egypt and the Gulf states, from taking sides with Russia. So the Polish president made this visit to Egypt. I'm glad that we had our say, that, as you said, we are friends with Poland, but that does not mean that we will listen to their own opinion, which is aggressive towards Moscow. We won't do it. Concerning how we deal with all these forces, let's not forget 2 points. The first one, yes, we have balanced diplomacy, but unfortunately, we have a heritage of more than 40 years of diplomacy since the 1970s and Camp David that we sided with the United States fully, and the Gulf War also. We would not, I will not say it was a bad decision. At that time, it was the unique force, and the Soviet Union was collapsing slowly till 1989, then the final collapse in 1990. So it was wise to work with the Americans. It was wise to work with the EU. But the fact that they have economic blackmail towards all these regions, all these countries in the region, it made us very slow in taking extreme and bold steps. We still need loans. And this is not the mistake of the current administration. No, it's all that is a heritage. Let's be clear. So we're paying a price for some decisions, as we are paying the price for Africa that we have neglected for years, and now President Sisi is trying to bond the ties again with every one of them to save what we could save now, because it's our own continent, our own backyard. We have to deal, we have to work with them, we have to call them brothers, as he calls them. We never did that. So we have the heritage now, a burden that we have loans to pay, we have things to do to please some countries, but we are struggling not to let them interfere in our internal affairs.
Yes.
The second point is about the gas. Are we able to do it, or are we willing to annoy Russia by this action? First of all, I think no, we would not take this step, because Russia is being squeezed by the sanctions. We were squeezed also by sanctions back in 2013. We had, let's not forget, more than a dozen of Apache helicopters sent to the States to be repaired. The Obama administration didn't want to give us back these Apaches. Who saved the scene to combat terrorism? It was the Russians with the MI and the K-52 Crocodile helicopters, the best, the top in the world. So they stood with us at the time of need. So I think that we have to do the same thing. These are our friends. We cannot abandon them. The second point about the gas, we cannot just export gas like that. We have regional treaties with Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Lebanon. We cannot neglect also the harassments of Turkey. It won't be that easy. So we are abiding to regional accords. The third point in the gas, and the final point in the gas, it's about the cost. It's not that easy.
Yes.
We have to call some external companies who has, like in Saudi Arabia, Aramco. It's not the Saudis who are exploiting the gas, it's the oil, the Americans. So the same thing. We don't have the equipment. We don't have the means. We have to call outside companies, and it would cost a lot.
Well, it seems that you've also mentioned the efforts that the Egyptian administration has been exerting in terms of strengthening the relations with the African continent, the relations that have been neglected for decades. And it's been on the agenda, it's been happening since 2019. One of the main events as well was the COP27, and Egypt really spearheaded the African continent, taking the lead role and being an ambassador for the African continent, fighting the African fight for climate change as well. How was this conference used as well to really highlight the weight and show the real political and diplomatic prowess of the Egyptian administration in light of the international community and what's been going on?
It was a show of force. We showed the world that we can, again, be hosting international conferences. The nations who doubted, and I mean by that, the Western nations who doubted the decision of the Egyptian people back in June 2013 in choosing their leadership again, now they are abiding to that, and they accepted our choice, so they came to Egypt. Nancy Pelosi, who was someone very harsh towards our president and our administration, she came and she was very friendly. This is bowing to the Egyptian will that we chose this path, we chose this president. So they have to accept it. This is democracy. The second point is that we have seen what some elements tried to do by calling the human rights and these actions, and it failed. It failed because they didn't get the support they wanted from the international press, from some foreign leaders, and especially from the Egyptians themselves. We were all hostile because you cannot use the COP27 for some mean goals to destabilize a country. You want to talk about human rights? Go ahead, make any conference about human rights, call it human rights, but do not go into an environmental conference and take advantage of it and make side conference and just label the country, the hosting country, about many crimes which never happened, and use it in a way to pressure this country. It was a failed strategy. Fortunately, it didn't work. The Egyptian administration didn't interfere at all. We left the scene as it is under the guidance of the UN, respecting everything, because they thought that we will take an action. No, we left everything. Everyone said what he wanted to say freely, and then the conference took place and everyone went home happy. Yeah,
yes.
There was no decisions, of course, because of the war, but it went fine at the end.
Yes. Well, you've mentioned the friendly sort of meeting between President Sisi and Nancy Pelosi, and we've quite recently as well saw and witnessed President Sisi attending the opening ceremony of the World Cup in Qatar, and we saw him meeting up with the Qatari leader and also meeting the Turkish President Erdogan. And it seemed that, because as well with the Qatari leader there was a lot of talks and banquets and talking about cooperation and normalization of relations, and we've seen over the past couple of years a roller coaster ride in terms of the relation between not just Egypt but a lot of the Gulf countries with Qatar and also with Turkey. How do you see these meetings, and do you see a change in the dynamics between the relations between Egypt and countries such as Qatar and Turkey?
Well, look, the first thing that I would like to mention is when you host international events like COP27 and the World Cup, you have to be friendly. You have no other choice. So I think that the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, had the advice. You have to talk to everyone. If you have enemies, invite them. And when he came to Egypt, he understood that the balance of exporting gas is not in his favor anymore, that Egypt is a potential player now. It will cost the West less to get the gas from Egypt than from Qatar, so things are changing. He didn't manage to take on his side the Gulf states against us. It was the contrary. The Saudis, the Emiratis told him that you have to talk with Egypt, you cannot just boycott Egypt. So he started by coming to Egypt, visiting President Sisi, attending all these meetings, and then invited President Sisi. I think it's also because of hosting the World Cup. He had to be that open. You saw everyone criticizing Qatar at the beginning, but he had to make this effort. Let's wait and see. The second point about President Erdogan, Egypt said it from the beginning, we have no any bad intentions towards the Turkish people at all. We have no bad intentions towards any nation except the regimes who, and President Sisi said it when he was Minister of Defense, who stood with the terrorist elements against Egypt. I think that President Erdogan made the initiative by trying to sanction some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood who are living in Turkey. And President Sisi was very open to this kind of gestures, but we're waiting for more. One of the main steps that we're still waiting for is their retreat from Libya, why they are there. And President Sisi made a very smart move after he met President Erdogan. He made the decision of limitation of our maritime borders for the Western Egypt towards Libya to test how their reaction, because we all know they are pro-Turkey, the government there. And suddenly they said, we don't recognize Egypt's decision, we don't like it, and we stand against it. So that means that the meeting was in front of the cameras, very nice, but when we talk real business, things are not that nice. So he said, President Sisi, by the way, we shake hands, but still our sovereignty is number one.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, still we have a lot more coming up on tonight's show, but now let's check out this report regarding some of the aims of the Egyptian Foreign Relations file for the near future. Let's check out this report and we'll be right back.
The 27th United Nations Conference of Parties COP27, which was hosted by Egypt in the Red Sea resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh last month, came at a critical time against the backdrop of a global pandemic, high energy prices, the war in Ukraine, and major disruptions to food supply chains. As host of the COP27, Egypt found itself on the world stage as a leading voice for the global south, and especially Africa, and looked to the summit as an opportunity to burnish its international prestige, emphasizing its Afro-Arab identity and positioning itself as a bridge builder between the global south and north. Cairo was placed at the center of international diplomacy not only as a representative of Africa and the Middle East, but as a representative of the global south. As host of the COP27, Egypt also put on the map its struggle to secure water resources. It was a continuation of a recent evolution wherein Cairo is pivoting back to Africa as a hybrid player, pitching itself as a gateway to Africa and a strategic player with a growing footprint on the continent. The pivot started with Egypt's presidency of the African Union in 2019, which Cairo used to advance its profile beyond the Nile Basin in North Africa. As president of the AU, Egypt represented viewpoints of the continent on the world stage, as for such as the UN General Assembly, Munich Security Conference, G7 Summit in France, and G20 Osaka Summit. From partnering with many countries and developing many strategic landscapes with other nations, Egypt has come far in this regard.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Continuing our discussion with Dr. Amir. Doctor, now we've We've seen a lot of developments taking place over the year. We've also seen, quite recently, last week, the US administration met with African leaders, and the president was there a week ago, really trying to strengthen their relations with the African continent, which seems to be quite fashionable among all the international community. We've seen over the, not just last year, but even the year before, we've seen Japanese African summits, Chinese African summits, German African summits, European Council African summits, and the US now is doing its own summit and meeting with the African leaders. What is the significance of such a conference? Is it safeguarding any potential interests, economic interests for, because it seems that the African continent is the one place that is very rich in natural resources and could be the sort of getaway card with dealing with climate change and other energy issues around the world?
Well, let me give you some elements that could explain what took place. Take example of Mali, Central Africa, the state called Central Africa, and we have also now Niger also. French troops, for the first time since the colonization, they retreated and replaced, they say, by the Wagner, which is a paramilitary force of the Russians, but replaced by the Russians and Russian experts, military experts. And we have also the African population praising President Vladimir Putin with the Russian flags and his photos, and very proud of him. And just look at the social media. All the African participating, giving comments are pro-Russian. The continent is now white, blue, red, Russian flag. It's a huge alert. It's not a red alert as we call it at the Soviet Union. Yeah. It's red alert. It's more than that. So the Americans, they had two options. First of all, as happened after 1945, the Second World War, they replaced the West, the Europeans. Look, for example, at the Suez conflict in 1952. They backed President Nasser against the British, the French, and the Israelis. And they wanted to take advantage of the downfall of these empires, the British and the French. So now they are trying to step forward to show the Africans, we are the nice guys. These are the colonization, we have nothing to do with them. Although they are the ones telling the Europeans you have to work against the Russians. And they don't want to face the Russians openly on the African continent. So they're trying to call them in summits in Washington, offer them a seat in the UN Security Council, offer them $55 billion as an aid, and also offering them projects as the Chinese are doing in their mainland. The fact that the Americans has also bad history in Africa and Somalia, it was a disaster at that time, and it ended as like the Vietnam War. So they want the African nations to forget that. The problem now is that the populations in these African countries are openly pro-Russians. So the Americans, they want by any means to regain or to replace, to replace the French who had to leave Mali, had to leave Bangui, the capital of Central Africa. By the way, the culture house of Russia there, there was an assassination attempt of its leader, its director there in Bangui. So it means there is now, let's say, a dirty war in the shadow between the West and Russia inside the African continent with assassination attempts. So all the weapons are used now. The Americans now are doing this summit to say openly, we are the good people and we want to replace the Europeans, forget about the Russians, forget about the Chinese, we have money and we have also diplomacy who could make you a replacement of all these Asian countries. You could be shining like them. I don't think it would work because the populations there are already under the spell of the Russians and the Chinese.
Do you think the US administration came in a bit too late?
The US administration came a bit too late in the Middle East, came a bit too late in Africa, came a bit too late in many parts, even in the conflict now in Ukraine. They thought that it would be a devastating defeat for the Russians, and then they discovered that the sanctions didn't work, everything didn't work, and the Russians used old weapons and just won the war. At the beginning, I mean, they got 4 these parts of Ukraine. So there is obviously instability in the decision-making process inside the White House, inside the State Department, inside the Pentagon, so on many levels. As we said, for the first time, he met with all the Arab leaders inside Saudi Arabia, and the next day the Chinese were there. This is a huge, huge sign that things are changing, and the Americans, they have to adjust their policies and be very aware that the map is changing, the world map is changing.
So if the world map is changing and maybe the US, I mean, maybe it's a strong term to use, but maybe taking a little bit of a backseat now in front of Russia or China. And you've mentioned how the European Union has been quite silent or idle under the current circumstances. Is it a time for now to really translate all these meetings and summits and conferences between Russia, many European countries, and Asia and Japan and China to actually implement and translate these meetings and agreements being signed and promises of developmental projects and funding to be translated on the ground to end this discussion once and for all for the African nations, because a lot of the African countries, not all countries are like Egypt or South Africa, and they're quite safe and stable, but there are a lot of African countries as well that are suffering and might be tempted by such an American offer. Well,
I think that still the superpowers are regarding their own interest. And by the way, when you said the Americans are retreating in a way, I have a quote from Samuel Huntington, the author of The Clash of Civilization. And he's the one who said in the 1990s that Ukraine will be the base of all these conflicts. And then he divided the map between the West and the East. And he made something very interesting. He said, all civilizations like the letter S. It becomes from a point and goes up, and then the curve goes down. Or you come from the bottom and then you go up. So you have to go to the top and then you will go down again. So I think this is what's taking place now. These forces, these empires, the fact that the French are leaving a country like Mali, the decline of the economy of Germany, the United States, who doesn't have any real say on the things in the Middle East, which is the hub of oil, gas, and all the energies. That means that countries like China, like Russia, they're not interested now in negotiating because it's not after that you felt that you didn't gain something from being aggressive that when you will call me to sit and talk that I will accept it. So the Russians are taking advantage of the weakness of this part. It's the part of history. The Russians were weak at a certain time during the last days of the Nikolai II Tsar in 1917, and the collapse of the Russian Empire, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now they want to regain their place. So of course not, they would not sit and talk like that, except as President Vladimir Putin said, if we are threatened, then all weapons are being used, diplomacy and nuclear weapons.
Well, so it seems that, I mean, the Russian advance took place on February 24th. It's almost 10 months now. It doesn't seem like there's an end to it within this year, at least. And it seems to be the one event that will be more or less directly or indirectly dictating the future of foreign relations around the world. Focusing on Egypt, what should be Egypt's aim for the next year? I mean, 2 weeks are left. How much can we actually do, or what should we be looking for in terms of 2023? What sort of normalization or diplomacy are we looking for towards Russia, for instance, towards the Gulf and the Far East? What sort of relations are we expecting to have within the rest of the African continent? Is the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam still on the agenda of the topics to tackle? What are Egypt's aims for the foreign relations file next year?
Egypt's aim is to gain time for stability, because we cannot afford any instability again after 2011. We have to gain time by calming all the parties, but things are not in our hands. The COVID-19 wasn't in our hands. The war between Russia and the West, it's not, let's call it like that, it's not in our hands. The exploding, this kind of prices, it's not in our hands. So the only thing that we have to work on is be open to negotiations, of course, with the Russians and the Chinese. They are gaining now force. Look at the Russians, now they control all the grains in Ukraine, all the gas, all the mines there, and we know that they have the most sophisticated armament. On the same time, Europe are our neighbors.
Yes.
And our neighbors, we have to work with them. We cannot neglect them. We need also their financial and diplomatic support. The United States is still the force that guiding everything over the scene. We have to listen to them also, but be very aware that what took place in 2011, after working as a close ally to the United States, one day it will end, and it will end dramatically. So we have to put it in mind.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, as Dr. Amir has mentioned and really illustrated how critical and sensitive the diplomatic relations are for a nation, especially for a country like Egypt, maintaining safety and security and stability within different political turmoils and developments taking place, not just in the African continent, but all over the world. And still a lot more needs to be done. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. Before we go, I'd like to thank my very distinguished guest with his very enriching discussion, Dr. Cherif Amir, the Professor of Political Affairs at the University of Paris. Dr. Amir, always a pleasure having you with us on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned for more coming up on NILE International. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for joining us.